This is Focus with Emma Griffiths on ABC Radio Brisbane.
When has history become personal for you? When has it meant more than a line in a history book? The big events that shape your world, big decisions that affect your life. Today on Focus, 3 men, elders of Brisbane, reveal their personal experiences of big moments in history. And it's interesting because we can all have different views of history, how it unfolded and what it meant. Well, between them, these 3 elders have more than 200 years of experience. Experience of war, of bigotry, poverty and injustice, and of working for change. I think they've had some good times along the way as well. These 3 wise men have put their experiences down in a book. You'll hear about that and from them through this hour. And from you, as you're listening, what moment in history has influenced your life? To share that, 1300 222 612. You can also text 0467 922 612, and you can email the Focus team, focusbrisbane@abc.net.au.
This is Focus with Emma Griffiths on ABC Radio Brisbane.
Well, 3 wise men, 3 elders of Brisbane talking about history. Everald Compton was the founding director of National Seniors, has most recently been on this show talking about assisted dying on behalf of the Clem Jones Trust. He's a powerhouse advocate for the aged and posts online as Everald at Large. Everald, hello again.
Good to be with you, Emma. Thanks for having me here.
Now, Uncle Albert Holt is a Murray elder. He's a community leader. He's been a police liaison officer. He helped establish the Murray courts. He was NAIDOC Elder of the Year in 2005 and received a Premier's Award for Seniors in 2007. Uncle Albert, hello to you.
Good to meet you. Thanks, Emma. Yeah.
And our third wise elder is Henry Palaszczuk. Now, Henry, we're told, is in Hong Kong, and we're trying to call him to get him onto the show as well. But he, as well as Everald and Uncle Albert Holt, have pulled together their thoughts on history in a book that has been published. It's called Goondeen Understanding Australia. Now, before we start the conversation, Uncle Albert, you want to acknowledge and welcome to country.
Thank you very much, Emma. It is with respect and humility I acknowledge all distinguished participants, much valued contributors who are here today. I applaud wholeheartedly and accept your genuine contribution here at this special event. I thank you for the privilege to acknowledge the very first Australians on whose land we reside, whose culture we celebrate as the oldest living culture in human history. I acknowledge elders past and present, custodians of this land in this wonderful part of the city of Brisbane, in this wonderful part of this world called Australia. I do feel so privileged and honoured not only to have this opportunity to participate at this very special event, but also as an Aboriginal elder extend to you all a most sincere, warm welcome. While one cannot gloss over a couple of 100 years of history as if it didn't happen, it did. And let me tell you, the story isn't too flash when it comes to the Aboriginal people of Australia. I'm of the view that you cannot begin any fresh thinking in any real way until you've begun that thinking from your heart. Perhaps some of you in this audience knows this history, and for many of you this has been a very personal and painful experience. Not just for yourselves, but in the stories such as elders like myself have passed down to you. Yes, I've heard the stories, very personal stories, moving stories of great sadness, stories also of enormous resilience and determination. There is no doubt there are a lot of things that we could do to make this world a better place. The first step is to get ourselves right, to get ourselves to a point where we have the confidence and competence to take on the challenges the world throws our way. With competence and confidence, we then have the motivation to move beyond our own lives, to move forward to help shape a more positive and productive world around us. To achieve anything, to move forward, we need to put in a degree of effort, for without effort, we will forever tread water in the one place. I hope you remember, like I do, that this continent called Australia, evidence-based and abundantly clear, was always and always will be Aboriginal land. I hope you remember, like I do, this continent called Australia, evidence-based and abundantly clear. As First Nations people, we have preserved the oldest culture of survival, proving to one and all we are resilient people. If we forget our history, we will never be able to correct the mistakes. So we dream, and although our walk today is short, we remember it is part of a longer journey for equality and justice. One of the fundamental lessons which could be learnt from past efforts to address and overcome the appalling problems of Indigenous disadvantage in our country is that education is the key. Education is the cornerstone upon which every individual builds their hopes and aspirations, opening another door of opportunity towards the improved welfare of their kinfolk, their community, and ultimately their country. To close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians is by empowering Indigenous children via education. We cannot face the future with hope unless we recognise and acknowledge our full history, the finest moments and the most shameful ones. Education and understanding of the complete Australian history underpins the efforts for reconciliation, moving together and closing the gaps. The learning of the complete history of Australia needs to be a priority in education and training for all Australians. None of us had a choice in where we were born, or when, or to whom. In this lottery of life, some paths will be easier than others. Tolerance comes from understanding, from providing the education to overcome ignorance, lack of understanding, to change mindsets and break down stereotypes. We need to know the history so that we don't repeat the traps of the past, to respect other cultures, their language, customs, and tradition. But to paraphrase a truly great man, Nelson Mandela, if we are to accomplish anything in this world, it will in equal measures be due to the work and achievement of many others. To make our communities and this country the best it can, we must work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much there. Uncle Albert Holt, a Murray elder and community leader, also has contributed to the book Goondeen with Everald Compton, who is here in the studio as well, and Henry Palaszczuk. Now, Henry Palaszczuk's overseas. We're trying to track him down, you know, but we can talk about some of the things that you've all written about anyway. Now, before we start, Uncle Albert, Goondeen is the name of this book. It's a Murray language term. What does it mean?
Well, Goondeen was, in a nutshell, a very clever man. He was a godly figure, and as far as I remember, he was everything, a doctor, you know, just a clever man. And I think these sort of reactions from him, like he used to make materialise money, and I think it was all about, he had the powers of hypnotism. Where
and that's you guys, is it? You're Goondeen.
Yeah, I didn't know I would have power. I didn't know you gave me that power, Albert.
Well, if you suspect that I've been hypnotised by these guys as you're listening, please call. Let Amanda Dell, our producer, know. Are there female Goondeen?
It was all males because, you know, the females were the most fragile of well, I don't know whether I should put it that way, but they needed...
I haven't met too many fragile ones lately, Albert.
Okay.
I'm a delicate flower. Just a delicate flower. But Bill Sinnott, who is the publisher of the book, writes in the foreword there that there is a follow-up book drawing on the wisdom of three female elders as well. So we'll get on with it then. Now, this book, Goondeen, asks, what is Australia and who are Australians? And draws on your experiences of big moments in history to try and help explain that. Everald Compton, first up, I mean, you've done a lot in your short life. Why did you want to be a part of this project?
Well, I got a phone call from Bill Sinnott one day. Bill's an old friend of mine, and Bill was willing to invest a lot of money in writing a book about understanding Australia. And he said to me he wanted three different types of Australians, and he'd asked Uncle Albert as a first Australian to be there, and he'd asked Henry Palaszczuk, because Henry was a refugee coming from war-torn Europe and settled in Australia, and he chose me because I am descended from a convict, and I'm a European-born Australian, so he wanted three different sorts of people, and he wanted us to discuss Australia as we saw it. So the first thing that happened was that Albert and Henry and I had lunches with the author, Susie Church, and Bill Sinnott, where we discussed all these things, and we found many things that we agreed upon and many things that our opinions diverged, but we never ever had great divergences. There was this central theme that we all loved Australia and we wanted it to be better, and we were concerned that not many Australians had ever thought about how the nation evolved from 65,000 years ago to 1788 to now, and I thought it was a great honour to spend time with Albert and Henry discussing this. It was a very great experience, and to do that and have many hours of talks with the author, Sophie Church. But I just felt it did help me as a person to understand the Australia that I grew up in, and I was delighted to take part.
Well, reading it as well, I think, has done that for me.
Yeah.
And for you, if you're listening and you have a story about history has been personal for you, the number is 1300 222 612. It is a bit of a complex sort of idea to get your head around. And as I was thinking about it, there were sort of decisions made by the Whitlam government before I was even born that really drove the fact that I ended up living in Brisbane.
Yeah.
Uncle Albert, the book begins with an account of the Mabo decision.
Yes.
And we hear from the three of you, Goondeen, wise men, on what that meant. How did it impact on you?
Yeah, look, in 1967, when we were given the opportunity to be recognised as citizens of our own country, at that particular time, I was in my early teens, and I was on a mission called Warrabinda Aboriginal mission. And when that decision was made by the voting public in the majority for human rights for the Aboriginal people, I felt as though the chain shackles that I had to my feet were taken off, and in that I was actually a free man, to walk out and do the things I wanted to do in another world, rather than being incarcerated in a mission where it was all about punishment, it was all about imprisonment, and if you'd done something wrong, and incarceration. And that it was awful, absolutely awful.
You write about Paul Keating's, or you talk about Paul Keating's Redfern address. I think it was 1992. This is just a little bit of what the then Prime Minister said.
Surely we can find just solutions to the problems which beset the first Australians, the people to whom the most injustice has been done. And as I say, the starting point might be to recognise that the problem starts with us, the non-Aboriginal Australians. It begins, I think, with an act of recognition. Recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases and the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was our ignorance and our prejudice and our failure to imagine that these things could be done to us. With some noble exceptions, we failed to make the most basic human response and enter into their hearts and minds. We fail to ask, how would I feel if this was done to me?
So that's Paul Keating, then Prime Minister, in 1992, speaking the Redfern address. It was in that inner Sydney suburb. When you hear that now, that was like 25 years ago, more.
Yep.
Do you think he was speaking ahead of his time? Do you think it's been acknowledged properly?
I was grateful that he put it out there as he saw it. And a speech like that, which came from evidence-based, from his heart, well, for me, it was something that needed to be done. If we couldn't go on in the situation that we were, I think it made a big difference, because to me, Paul Keating would have been one of the greatest Prime Minister Australia has ever had. And, he calls a spade, and I really felt that he was a genuine person that had no hatred for Aboriginal people.
I think it was one of the great speeches of Australian history, Emma. When I heard the Redfern speech, it was very courageous and it offended a lot of people, but as Albert said, it needed to be said, and I think it goes down as one of the great speeches that we have. And the whole Mabo thing had an enormous impression on me, because here was Eddie Mabo living on an island that his people had occupied for thousands upon thousands of years, and he had to prove that it was his island. I just sitting there saying, how could they have dispossessed Eddie Mabo for all those years when he lived on that little island?
And Everald, you talk in the book about how you'd never realised that there was this denial that Indigenous people of Australia even existed.
Oh, yeah. I grew up ignorant of the things that happened. When I met Henry for lunch, not Albert, for lunch, and Henry, and Albert said to me, until 1967, the first 35 years of my life, I was a non-person. I didn't even have a birth certificate. If I died, there wouldn't have been a death certificate. I couldn't vote. I was not recognised, and I was put on a mission station. I thought to myself, how would I have reacted to that 35 years? And what I love about Albert is while it affected him enormously, he bears no bitterness about that, and no bitterness towards me as a white man. And I don't think we realise what we did. We sent Aboriginal soldiers to the war, and because when they came back, they weren't Aboriginal, they weren't Australian citizens, they were not entitled to a war pension because they weren't citizens. They were just sent back to the reserve, and I sat there and I cringed at all of those thoughts of what impact that had.
Talking about history today, and when history becomes the very personal, when has a moment in history or a decision, a big decision made, when has it become extremely personal for you? Shaped your life? 1300 222 612 is the number to call in with your story of that. Want to move on to other moments in history as well, but still on this particular theme. You ask in this book, Goondeen, who are Australians? Mm-hmm. Well, last week, Marcia Langton, the renowned Indigenous academic, was on Focus talking about her new book. It's called Welcome to Country. And she was a Brisbane girl. I asked her about her memories of growing up and going to school in Brisbane.
Well, they're mixed. My memories of school are mostly horrible. School here was a hell, a living hell. You're too young to remember how racist Queensland was back then. Continues to be in some respects, but every day was a living hell if you were the wrong colour back then. Queensland was segregated, and the teachers and the other students were almost to a person vicious racists. I can remember 2 or 3 people who weren't in my whole school career.
How does it feel coming back to Brisbane?
You know, there are other parts of Australia that have a similar history and just as bad, and one looks for improvement. I quite like the climate here.
Do you see any improvement? Do you hear of any improvement?
There's a lot of improvement, yes.
That's Marcia Langton on Focus last week. And that question around improvement in racist attitudes in Queensland, in Australia. Uncle Albert Holt, as a Murray elder, a Goondeen, do you see any improvement?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. One of the first and foremost improvements is that in my family, I've got grandchildren now and great-grandchildren who have European mothers or fathers. never in my wildest dreams did I think that it ever occurred. And, you know,
why is that?
Well, the apartheid system that we existed under was worse than South Africa, between the blacks and whites over there. But at least we were a minority group of people here, so we were controlled, not like the rebellion against the apartheid system that was there in South Africa. You know, we, in every turn, we had to feel ashamed of who we were born. And, you know, the discrimination, for goodness sake, where, you know, going into a town and not being able to use public toilets, I thought was horrific that humans could be, you know, that cruel to people, and that's how we used to wear it.
It's different for your grandchildren.
It is, absolutely. And, you know, they could aspire to whatever they want to be, because in my schooling, we were allowed to go to kindergarten schooling at 6 years of age. And then if you were successful to get 4 grades in, 1, 2, 3, 4, you were successful, yes, you were sent out to work. And, you know, and I'm talking about 10, 11 years of age, because if you failed in that first 4 years, they kept you down and gave you another year. But that's, and I'll never forget the teacher. Every day we used to hear that Captain Cook founded Australia, and don't just forget it. And yeah, and then he discouraged us, you know, from our food that was our food that we used to live on through fishing and hunting, and you know, talk about the filthy food and tucker that we used to eat. Yeah.
And where do your grandchildren go to school? Just which suburb, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, well, I've got... they
too many to really know. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. That'd be the answer to it. Yeah.
Well, it is Reconciliation Week next week, and the theme of Reconciliation Week is "Don't Make History a Mystery," which I think you're helping to address, both of you today, yeah. Uncle Albert and Everald Compton, and Henry Palaszczuk would too if he was here, but he's in Hong Kong.
Can I make a comment about...
I'd love you to, Everald.
I went to school. There was a difference between a little bush town and the city. I went to school I lived in a timber village called Monsaldale up near Kingaroy, and we only had 13 children in the school, and 2 of them were Aboriginal children. Now, the town was totally based around a timber mill, and Fred Dumbledon, an Aborigine, worked in the timber mill, and he was a very good worker, and he and his wife ran a very nice house, and Jackie and Kathleen came to school nicely dressed, and they mixed in with the school, and no one noticed their skin at all. I grew up, I did not look upon them as Aborigines, they were my mates. Now, when I came to Brisbane and Toowoomba, the attitude was totally different. You know, kids got around the school talking about abos and whatever. Now, Jackie and Kathleen Dumbledon remain my friends. I've lost contact with them now. They're my age if they're still alive. But the fact was that they were a respected part of that community. That was totally different to an Aboriginal mission, wasn't it? Fred Dumbledon was out there with a job. That was the difference, wasn't it, Albert?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for me, since my brain started to function, now I don't know, that was a very early age, and living in Sherbag, and I wondered what was going on, because at night, Megan, which was only 3 miles away, was illuminated with electricity, and here in Sherbag, we had to flounder in the darkness. There was no lights, and that to me was devastating.
Yeah.
What about it?
Well, I guess the fact that why did this should happen to human beings? Because our bodily functions are all the same. And, when we get cut, we bleed, same as any. But for me, the restrictions that were on us, we could only go to Megan permits only, was something that was so hateful. And, I remember going into the shops, and we always were told that we had to go to the back of the queue. We could never go to the front of the queue in front of a white person being served. And the restrictions on us was that, we were on Shanks's pony, we had no transport or anything, so we used to walk the 4 miles. And it was quite a walk, but there was a permit system that allowed us a certain amount of time to go in, and we didn't have much money or to shop anyway. So, but I remember this shop that I used to go to. This bloke used to really have fun with me, because I'd go in and think it was appropriate to go up to the counter and get what I asked what I wanted to buy, and he'd say to me, "Now, when you come into the shop, you always go to the back of the queue. You could never come to the front of the queue." I used to simply be devastated. And even when people were there, he wouldn't call me over, wasn't there, he wouldn't call me over to serve me. He'd just... And look, in the camps, this is what it seemed to me to be. In the camps, we used to have dogs, animals and that sort of thing. And when animals were, treated badly, like being kicked in the ribs and things like that, and the reaction to that with cruelty to animals was, especially dogs, they used to go and slink away and look for a place to hide. And when this shopkeeper used to tell me, my mind used to go, my thoughts used to be go to the dog that got badly treated and went to hide, find a place to hide.
And you felt like that?
Yeah.
Well, we're talking when history is very personal today on Focus on ABC Radio Brisbane. I'm Emma Griffiths, and you've been listening to Uncle Albert Holt, a Murray elder, his personal account there of being a child on the Cherbourg mission. Everald Compton as well is here in the studio. Both of them have told their stories, their experiences and insights into big moments in history in a book that's just been published. It's called Goondeen Understanding Australia. We've got some calls coming in, people with personal impacts of history. Sally in Cooperoo. When did something in history in Australia become personal for you?
Oh, hi, Emma.
I'll get you to turn the radio down if we could, Sally.
Yeah, sorry, hang on. This is me, I'm on the radio.
Yeah, I love hearing myself back too. Sally, so when did history become very personal for you?
Okay, Emma, look, I went to 9 different primary schools and 3 of those years were in Mount Isa, so I had a very upfront, close personal contact with Aboriginal people in Mount Isa.
And what did you see?
Oh, it was unbelievably appalling. Now, I was only 8 and 9, 10 years old at the time, but my mum actually founded an health service for Aboriginal children in Mount Isa. And I used to go round with her to visit some of the families, and I just could not believe the conditions that people lived in. But the one moment in my history that really stuck in my memory and changed my view on everything was Mum just kept writing letter after letter after letter to the Queensland government. And in those days it would have been the Bjelke-Petersen government. Of course, she got no response. And then one day we got one of those cylindrical postal tubes in the mail addressed to Mum with a letter inside saying, regards from the Queensland government, and there were 2 posters. One had an Aboriginal person washing their hands, and the second one had an Aboriginal person putting some rubbish into a rubbish bin, and that was their contribution.
That was the resource.
9, I just remember, I mean, that just really shaped my political thinking from then on. I just could not believe the utter, absolute indifference from a government. And that has really shaped my thinking ever since.
Well, that's how history becomes very personal, doesn't it? Thank you very much for your call, Sally. You can turn the radio up again now. Pete's in Taringa. Pete, listening to this, when does history become very personal for you?
Hi, Emma. It's interesting. I was born in 1948 and I went to Indooroopilly State School. And at the school, we were brought up really immersed in Aboriginal culture to a large degree. I mean, there was a lot of projects we did, building Aboriginal implements like shields and spears and stuff like that. And I remember in scholarship, we had our leading, or the book for that year was A Timeless Land by Ellen the Dark. And for us, this white institutional racism was totally beyond us because we didn't see any of that. I mean, later, of course, it kicked in, when, that you'd tell, or I wouldn't, but you'd hear people tell jokes and that sort of thing about minorities, including Aboriginal people. And I always thought, where does this come from? I never really understood it. And my parents always respected the Aboriginal culture and they loved Aboriginal people, and we'd always engage with Aboriginal people when we could. And so for me, turning 70 this year, it's really, I still shake my head. I see it, but I don't understand it. And the other thing, too, is interesting. When that lady was talking about Mount Isa, as a broadcaster for many years, I started my radio career at 4LN in Mount Isa, and I saw with my own eyes the disgusting behaviour of feral white Australians absolutely treating Aboriginal people like garbage, particularly at closing time when the pubs would close. They'd come in and do terrible things to them. It makes me quite emotional when I think about it.
So that's when did it really hit you then?
That's exactly when it kicked in, that I thought, how could they do this? How could they do this to these defenceless people? It was just, I don't know, it turned me off. And from that time, I think I became a lot more sort of proactive in supporting Aboriginal people. I'd march with them sometimes in their demonstrations. And no, it's always been a mystery to me why this disgusting behaviour has continued. And I applaud people like Everald and Uncle Albert who are standing up there and fighting for the rights and for the the explosion of this racist nonsense, that should never be there in the first place.
That's
Beautiful
great.
people, and when you engage with Aboriginal people or Indigenous people, they're soft, they're beautiful, they love the culture, they're interesting to talk to, and they're full of love. That's the whole thing. They're not aggressive and nasty and full of frustrations, which they would be.
Thank you very much, Pete. It's great to hear from you. Certainly my mates who are Aboriginal have cracker senses of humour. Oh, my goodness. Now, Damien is in Mackay. Damien, you've just started reading the book that Uncle Albert and Everald Compton have pulled together, Goondeen. What do you think?
It's very big awakening, contrasting to Pete during my school years. Primary school, they spent a lot of time learning Indigenous culture, but unfortunately, after about grade 6, it just sort of ended, and we delved into it in SOS, but not really that far. We didn't really touch base on the Mabo Act, and which is the chapter I've just read, which is the first chapter, and it's funny because it's just not something. I'm 27 now. This is 10 years ago I finished my school, and we just hadn't really learned about that perspective, And that being said, I'm the son of, or I come from a convict. My father's side's the convict side, and my mum was an immigrant to Australia. And it's funny because there's this perspective that you don't hear about, or really about the Australian narrative. So I'd like to, congratulate Uncle Albert, Everald, and Henry on putting together this book.
Thank you. Could I make a point in before we move on to perhaps the discrimination against women, which I hope we can talk about, Emma?
Well, we've got 15 minutes left, Everald, so there's a lot to get through.
But could I just say that the speech that Martin Luther King made at Washington in 1963 or whatever it was, where he said, I have a dream that one day no man shall be judged by the colour of his skin, but by the purity of his soul. And that's the whole message, isn't it, Albert?
Yep.
Thank you very much, Damien, for calling. The book is called Goondeen Understanding Australia. It's been written by Sophie Church, who is an historian, and it's drawing on the experiences of history from Everald Compton, who is a founding director of National Seniors, who's an advocate for the aged, quite a powerhouse. You just never, I don't know, Everald, you're never bored around you. Never, ever. You're a powerhouse. He posts online as Everald at Large. Uncle Albert Holt is a Murray elder and a community leader. And Uncle Albert, I've read that you go to schools and you talk to school students about your history and experiences. You still do that?
I do, and I go to a lot of schools, and I'm in demand because they get something out of my history. But one of the things I've grew up with is that to challenge anybody, you've got to have the same education as they get, because education is everything when it comes to levelling the playing field.
You do in this book look at other big issues in Australia. So the introduction of Medicare, you look at the Gonski reports into education, the debate about how to reduce Australia's carbon emissions. You look at the status of women and equal pay there, that's still not equal. And I guess all of it comes under that theme of leadership of the nation. Where do Australians look for leadership now, do you think? Everald Compton?
Well, it is largely absent in Australia at the moment, and I think that's because we've politicised the nation in all sorts of ways, and we don't seem to have, and I suppose all of us look with nostalgia to the past, the sort of leaders who will make a difference. For instance, when Gough Whitlam, with great opposition, brought in equal equal pay for equal work. I was in Parliament the day it happened, and I actually thought that was an historic moment. I stood up and clapped when that happened. But then it didn't happen because the fellas immediately said, well, they're not doing equal work. That's the way they got round it. And so immediately what I thought was an historic moment. But Whitlam had the courage to get up and do that. And now we still have this gap, not just in wages, but in opportunity and in all sorts of ways where women aren't given, and they're harassed on the job and all sorts of things. And I believe we need a leader now who's going to step forward and say we can't have a nation that's like that. We can't have a nation where women aren't game to walk the streets because of the harassment that's on. And so we need some leaders to step forward. I can't see them on the horizon at the moment, but I hope they're going to come, and I've got a feeling they're going to be female.
Isn't that what I say? The future is female. You know how to play to your audience, don't you, Everald Compton? Uncle Albert, when you look at leadership of the nation at the moment, and I guess we come back to this issue of reconciliation and the future for recognition of history, Reconciliation Week next week, the theme is Don't Make History a Mystery. The big development in recent times has been the Uluru Statement from the Heart. What do you think of the way that statement, which came out of months of consultation with First Nations people in Australia, has fallen off the table?
Yeah, well, look, I don't want to be political here, but I think...
I'll let you be political, Albert. You be political.
Maybe we'll ask Everald then.
But looking back over the years, that I really got to take an interest in politics, but then I wasn't too keen. But for me, and probably a biased thought or opinion, was that the greatest prime ministers we ever had here in Australia was Gough Whitlam, Paul Keating.
I thought you said you didn't want to get too political. Dearie me.
Yeah, well, that's how we have to live here, under control of different prime ministers and things.
So I guess if you do you see a way forward then for reconciliation in Australia?
Well, education is the key, as I said.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
could I make a point, Emma, that we've got to fix this constitutional thing. The Uluru Statement can't just be pushed away. Now, we must have a few words at the start of the Constitution, even if it's only 3 lines, that says this nation, this continent, has been occupied for 65,000 years, and that is the heritage on which this nation is built. Some way or another, that's got to be put right at the start.
Okay, well, I imagine that there's just going to have to be more discussion around it. We're certainly having a lot of discussion around that on the station as well. To another issue as well that's tackled in the book, and it's one of the defining moments of more recent history, I guess, and that is the 9/11 attacks. Now, for Australians, this led to our contribution to wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It still drives the war on terror. Everald, you say in the book that it was really nothing compared to World War II, and you think that the world panicked.
True. We got involved in wars in recent times that we never should have become involved in, and there was an enormous overreaction to 9/11, a very emotional one. And what I remember on 9/11 was not just the horror, because I had a son and daughter-in-law who were in New York, and my daughter-in-law was in the next building to the one that got hit by the plane. So it was a very important time where we tried to contact her. But America
very personal history.
And America went a bit overboard on that and thought up an excuse to invade Iraq over weapons of mass destruction that weren't there. The Arab world has been under dispute for 2,000 years, or more. The tribes have always fought one another. There's never been cohesion there. And they've never been a democratic type of society. There's always the chief in charge, and that's where. And we tried to put Western democracy in there, and so we overreacted. It was nothing like World War II. When I was going to school, we had to dig trenches in the school ready for the Japanese invasion, and we used to go out and have practice in the trenches, which had to be zigzag so they couldn't get us all in one go, and there'd be a siren as if the planes were coming, and we'd do that. But World War II was an important war because we had to stop an absolute tyrant in Adolf Hitler and another one called Tojo, who would have created a fascist world, and it was in the balance for a long time. Many people died. Now, that was a war for which there was a need to be fought to stop that. I believe the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we never should have been there. Those lives never should have been lost. The whole idea that we're going to turn them into a little United States was just crazy. Yeah.
World War II, you were also very young at the time that World War II came to an end, Uncle Albert. How did that impact on you?
Well, it had an impact on me because one of my brothers, he was working outside the mission, and those days, the workers would get sent out to work, and he was working at Maryborough, and in that time they were recruiting soldiers to go overseas and fight, and clearly it's documented in the local rag that he went to the recruitment office to join up, and they rejected him on the reasons he was Aboriginal. And look, sadly, he took his own life. He went back to the place where he was working and asked his boss to lend him a rifle. He was going hunting, and then they found him dead. He had a bullet hole in his forehead. But and that was when, and at that time too, Menzies, he went on record as saying Aboriginal people aren't educated enough to go to war, and it was outlawed. I know some of them did go to war, but to have a Prime Minister of Australia, being that racist that they had nothing to contribute in terms of going to war.
That was right, Albert, because in the 1914 war, they conscripted Aborigines to go to France. Totally different situation. Shows you what a few decades does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Talking history today, and it has been an illuminating discussion. Great to get, or more than great, to get your views today. You, Goondeen of Brisbane, Everald Compton and Uncle Albert Holt have contributed to the book called Goondeen Understanding Australia, along with Henry Palaszczuk. A couple of messages have come in from listeners. Noel at Belmere says, as a child, my mother always said, just remember the Aboriginal people were here first. That message to me carried more complexity than one might first think. Noel, I'd love to hear about that complexity. You can email focusbrisbane@abc.net.au because we're coming to the end of the show. Tracy in Shorncliffe says, Hello, Tracy. Tracy wholeheartedly agrees with you, Everald, about the comments on the Twin Towers attacks and World War II. History gets rewritten. History is a living thing, really, and it does depend on how you view it, how you've been impacted by it. And it's the really beautiful ethos behind this book, Goondeen Understanding Australia, written by Sophie Church with Everald Compton, Albert Holt and Henry Palaszczuk. And you can also engage with the whole Goondeen fellowship, I guess, online. It's on Facebook, that's for sure. And this program will be on our website a bit later in the day. Uncle Albert, Everald Compton, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us here, Emma.
Very much appreciated.
And a privilege to be with Albert.
Likewise.
Bit of a bromance here, hey? Thanks very much for your time. I'll be back with you tomorrow at 10.
Stargazing Live returns. Join us tonight as we look skyward once more.